Welcome back to the Infotagion podcast, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom. This is the first major public health crisis in the age of social media disinformation, and we're here to try and make sense of it. I'm Damian Collins MP, co-founder of Infotagion, and today we're joined by our special guests, Guy Berger, the Director of Freedom of Expression and Media Development at UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and Nina Jankowicz, who is the Disinformation Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and also the author of a new book, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News and the Future of Conflict, which will be published by IB Tauris on the 9th of July. We'll also be hearing, as always, from our resident experts, the disinformation analyst Dr. Charles Creel and John Quinlan, the CEO of Iconic Labs. In this podcast, we'll be talking about research into quantifying the amount of COVID-19 disinformation and who's responsible for taking action against it. Guy Berger, we recently had World Press Freedom Day, and I know this has been a major part of UNESCO's work over the last few years. And I was particularly struck by the new briefing that UNESCO has put out based on research quantifying the amount of disinformation that exists related to COVID-19. And in particular, I was particularly struck by the research done by the Bruno Kessler Foundation, which found that 40% of some 112 million posts that they analysed were considered to be from unreliable sources. It really does give an astonishing insight into just the volume of disinformation people are seeing about what is a major public health emergency.
Absolutely. It's quite distressing to see those kind of statistics, which indeed UNESCO did release those and some others that we tracked down for the World Press Freedom Day, which was on the 3rd of May. And there were for a meeting that we had. It was, in fact, unprecedented to bring together the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and the head of UNESCO, and the head of the Office of the Human Rights Commission together to talk about these issues, disinformation and press freedom, because, of course, the supply side of countering disinformation and misinformation does depend a lot on journalism. And if journalism is being hammered, that's a problem. So these statistics that we put together were to try to map a little bit about the presence of what we call the disinfodemic, which is both disinformation and misinformation, but basically false content online. Now, the difficulty that one has in trying to do this is that if you're working on the supply side, you need to kind of know what you're up against. And if you're working on the audience side, as to what people need to know to navigate through this crisis, you're dependent on what's happening on the transmission side, which is in the middle. And that's the internet companies by and large, but also media. The difficulty is that the internet companies release very selective information. So some of the information, for example, that we had in our document, which anybody can get, by the way, just World Press Freedom Day, Disinfodemic UNESCO, Facebook said that they had identified 40 million posts in March, which they deemed to be problematic in terms of disinformation. Now, they don't give granular information as to how did these posts circulate beforehand, where did these come from, how many were from officials, how many were from bots, how many were from ordinary people. You don't know what the thematic is, you don't know if they were text, memes. It's very, very difficult to work on the supply side or the receiver side if you don't know what the patterns are in the transmission sides, because the transmission side is important. So it's a difficult mapping exercise that we were trying to do when we couldn't get substantive information from the internet companies. And at the same time, I should signal, if I may, that UNESCO has published 2 policy briefs in addition to this World Press Freedom Day document, which explain why we came up with this notion of disinfodemic. And if I can touch on that briefly, because I think it is related to this question of press freedom and disinformation. So these 2 policy briefs were produced by 2 academics in the UK, Julie Passetti and Kalina Boncheva, connected to Sheffield University. And they did an excellent mapping of the kind of responses that are taking place. And so they categorized responses to this epidemic in terms of those that are in the identification business, because of course there's some information that's in a gray area. It's not necessarily false, it's not necessarily true, it's unknown. So how do you identify this stuff? How do you dig into it? What's the media doing in terms of investigative journalism? That's the identification side. Then they looked at the contextual side, which is really regulation, about trying to create an intervention that will change the mix of information and disinformation through law, counter messaging, criminalization in some cases, and so on. And then they looked at two more areas. The one was the audience responses, which I've touched on, and I think the normative responses about combating disinformation should not violate freedom of expression. This is really a critical thing that we're pushing. But a normative response, such as this meeting we had with these UN heads, was exactly to boost the norms that let's not throw out one of the key antidotes to disinformation by in the name of jumping down with disinformation. And then, of course, there's also education of the audiences, media and information literacy. We do a lot of that and so on. But the last part that they focused on was this transmission dimension, which is the internet companies. And internet companies are doing something unprecedented, but still the transparency is not really there. And the kind of information that is being disclosed is understandably self-interested, but it doesn't really help others involved in this game to really see what the patterns are online, because that would really assist a lot. So I think that's something, one takeaway that comes out of this. And the last takeaway I just want to signal as well is that, where does UNESCO and the UN go to from here in continuing to publish and research and call for more transparency? Well, we're toying with the idea of a global consultation about what lessons can be learned so far, because this is a unique kind of disinformation, misinformation. The responses are also fairly unique in some ways. What can we learn about that? And so we want to have consultations with parliamentarians, for example. I hope that you, Damian, would be very much engaged with us in that particular one, but also to have a consultation with the technology companies to say, look, can't you actually be more systematic and more transparent in this issue? And then to work with judges, media and information literacy actors, civil society, and so on, so that we can really produce some kind of comprehensive assessment of how it's going. Because most of these responses, according to these two policy briefs, they don't have monitoring and evaluation components built into them. They're not doing a human rights impact assessment. And their theory of change is rather kind of implicit rather than explicit. So I leave it at that for now.
I think this is one of the key problems, because I know, looking, the work we've done with Infotagion and other fact checkers do as well, that we can check facts of what we see online. We can ask the public to call out and flag up what they see that doesn't look right, so that it can be checked out. But in some ways, it's the mechanism for the distribution of this content, a sense of what are the key nodes and groups and accounts which are responsible for spreading this, and what action is being taken against them. And it's only really the tech companies that can see that properly. Everyone else is external to that process, and we've no real way at the moment of auditing the figures that they give us, or doing it, or if you feel something bad has happened or has gone wrong, to inspect it. And indeed, coronavirus is a classic example of this, because it would be great if after coronavirus, or even starting sooner than that, we could audit the way in which disinformation spread throughout this public health emergency. But at the moment, we lack the power to do that with the rigor we'd probably like.
Yes, exactly. And I do think that much as this whole period is a watershed for various things, sometimes it will create a bad new normal, sometimes a good new normal. But I think we've got to really come out of this getting much more cooperation from the internet companies about what information they've got, of course, bearing in mind the privacy safeguards, but what they can make available that can help us assess the patterns by which this disinformation is spreading, the types, the origins, the automation, the themes, the formats, etc.
Now, I'm delighted we're joined on this podcast by Nina Jankowicz as well from the Wilson Center in Washington. I met Nina earlier in the year when I attended a conference she organized on disinformation, which was only in February, but feels like it was a sort of lifetime ago. But Nina, you've got a fantastic new book called How to Lose the Information War, which has been published in July. And I was drawn to your sort of summary towards the end of the book, or looking forward to the 2028 US presidential election cycle, where information sort of infodemics and information warfare are still a part of society. But I thought you were suggesting that maybe the solution comes from ultimately the public being made more aware and more questioning of what they see. And for you, ultimately, is that what we have to do with this? Is actually that the solution has to be a much higher level of public awareness of what's happening. And if that is the case, do you actually think in a way that this coronavirus infotagion, infodemic, whatever word you use, is helping people become more aware of this problem than they were before?
So I definitely think that we need a higher level of public awareness and understanding of how these operations work. So the last thing that you and Guy were touching on about the platforms, being more transparent in the things that they're taking down and the types of things they're seeing, I think that's key. Facebook just released the other day its April report on coordinated inauthentic behavior, the takedowns that it did, looking at countries like the Republic of Georgia, things that were coming out of Russia and Ukraine. And for me, even as an expert on this stuff, we're only getting, the tip of the iceberg when you look at that report, a couple of posts per takedown. And really that's not enough to understand how these bad actors are operating. So there's clearly, some sort of, it's incumbent on the platforms, I think, to release more of that data. But I would also say that governments have been really, really behind in their responsibility toward educating their citizens. And this comes, in two different forms. One, we've not invested in the West, for the most part, in the type of public awareness, media literacy, digital literacy campaigns that we need to communicate what this threat looks like. But on the flip side of that, we're also seeing governments across, the transatlantic community using the very same tactics that bad actors like Russia and China are using for their own political purposes. And that's one of the big conclusions of the book. We cannot dip into the Russian playbook or the Chinese playbook for our own purposes if we're going to mount a successful response to countering disinformation domestically. And if there's one thing I think, the infodemic during coronavirus has shown is that, there are many, many domestic purveyors of disinformation. We kind of ensconced ourselves in the belief over the past 4 or 5 years that this is something that comes from outside of our borders and we would never do that. But actually, because of the democratization of the tools of disinformation, i.e. social media platforms, this is available to anybody who wants to use it and has a few spare bucks in their back pocket. So it's a really scary time. And as for your last point about, is the pandemic creating greater awareness of disinformation and its tools and tactics? I'm not sure, because we're seeing it spread on a greater level than we've ever seen before. And I think it just goes to show that, disinformation isn't just about fake stories. It's about emotional manipulation. And that's something I've really been trying to get across in my engagement around this topic over the past few months, which is, people need to not just understand how information spreads, they need to understand how they're being manipulated. So I've been advocating for informational distancing in addition to social distancing. If you feel yourself getting really emotional about something you're reading online, there's a chance that you're being manipulated. So the best thing to do is to close your laptop or put down your phone, walk away and consider the source. Think about what that journalist or that organization has in it for them to manipulate you. And I think that can really slow the spread of the bad information that we're seeing, travel at the speed of light during this infodemic or infotagion.
I know I completely agree with you on that. And I think in some ways that's why the use of terms like infotagion or infodemic or disinfodemic is right, because actually we should see it as a form of virus that some people are immune to, but it infects other people. And then people then either start to share this information or come to believe in it and propagate this disinformation as well. So it is almost like a sort of a viral infection of the information system. And we discussed in a previous podcast with Sasha Havlicek and Edward Lucas, the point that you made as well, that this is not just being done by external actors; it's people within our society, within our country, who are helping to propagate this virus throughout society. I'm going to ask you both. I mean, I think there's a sense from you both that the big tech companies should be doing more. Do you think ultimately we can ever rely on them to do this voluntarily, or do you think we will ultimately need some sort of regulatory oversight, just as in Europe we have that on data privacy? Do you think we'll need that on information health as well?
I certainly do. I mean, yesterday Facebook announced the members of its new oversight board, which will have the authority to listen to appeals about what content can be on the platform and what can be removed. But as everyone on this podcast knows, that's only a very small sliver of the problem of Facebook, right? We need more transparency into its algorithm. We need more transparency into its, economic practices, how advertising works. So I think, this is a step towards self-regulation that Facebook is trying to take, and it's at a convenient moment, I would say, when we're all feeling a bit more warm and fuzzy towards social media because it's allowing us to connect with our friends and family around the globe that we can't see at this moment. But certainly, I think especially the United States has abdicated its responsibility in terms of regulating the tech companies. They are based here in the U.S., and we have a responsibility toward the rest of the globe to set the democratic standard for what social media regulation should look like. We regulate a lot of other industries, telecoms, our elections, certainly trade and competition. And right now, all of those commissions in the United States are playing a part in trying to regulate the internet. But we don't have an agency looking at just that. And I think hopefully, as the political scene starts to change here, if it does, we can depoliticize this topic and look at it as, something we need to do to protect our democracy, because the tech companies, the social media platforms don't have our democracy in their best interest. They have their economic interests at heart. And I think that's understandable, if not, of course, lamentable, but that's the job of government. And so far, the job of government has not been fulfilled.
Yeah, and just to add, as you brought up the Facebook Oversight Board as well, I mean, of course, because the Oversight Board can't take into account any local laws. Their only job is to determine whether Facebook will follow their own policies correctly, and which I think just gives you an idea of there's a lot of fanfare around this, but it's very limited in its scope, and is really by no means a body that would innovate new policies or ideas or bring change to Facebook.
Yeah, precisely. And, I think they did do a good job at trying to make it sort of geographically diverse, although you'll notice, and I'm someone who has a background in Central and Eastern Europe, there's one Eastern European on the board. He's a Hungarian constitutional law professor, but there's not necessarily anybody who has, expertise in Russia or Ukraine specifically. And I find that very worrisome, because that's where we're seeing a lot of the most troublesome content still coming from to this day. And there will be, 20 more members added to the board. So hopefully we'll continue to see that geographical diversity represented. But I still worry about the smallest, markets for Facebook not being represented on that board, not having people with the cultural and linguistic and political expertise in the countries that they'll be ruling on, making decisions that are going to reverberate around the world. I think we really need subject matter experts beyond just, internet law, constitutional law, et cetera, who are going to be making those decisions. And it's an impossible task for Facebook. And again, I think you're exactly right, Damian. That's where we need governments to step up, because they know their people better than anybody else, certainly.
Yeah. So, I mean, Guy,
if I could jump in here,
yeah.
Damian, just on this topic, I think this is, of course, the very hot debate. I think we can learn from what happens with the press, because essentially the press works best when there's self-regulation, and it only self-regulates seriously when there's a threat of governmental regulation. But once you have governmental regulation of the press, then you're on a very difficult path, I think, in terms of freedom of expression. And so with the internet companies, I think we need to be cautious, because in a sense, regulation should not be rushed in. It should be a last resort, I think. And at the same time, the threat of regulation may lead to these companies better self-regulating. On the other hand, of course, some of them would like to be regulated so they can just, have a very simplistic system of curating content that's in accordance with particular governments. Not all governments, and I say this working for an intergovernmental organization, not all governments know their people that well and would want to see regulation of a kind of a self-regulation that works. So I think that we need to take a global perspective on this and keep in mind that, what you wish for can sometimes be more dangerous than what you've got. So I think this period does lend itself to really putting a lot more public pressure on the companies to do a better job in self-regulating and being transparent. And having said that, I also wanted to mention that, we speak sometimes of this term infodemic, which was coined by the World Health Organization. And actually, it's interesting, the way they use it is not to refer to disinformation and misinformation. They refer to the totality of information on the subject, in this case, COVID-19, and the difficulty of people judging what's accurate, what's not accurate within that, and what is the unknown. Now, I think what would become interesting, because especially if we remember about this, the middle ground, the stuff we don't know, the stuff that is legitimately contested, then I think it can lead us to looking in a more nuanced way, because it could be that in elections you see a greater prevalence of disinformation, a greater prevalence of emotion, and maybe in this case, or in case of vaccination, there's a greater prevalence of misinformation, and maybe it's more driven by political advantage or by people trying to sell false goods. But we can only know that difference and that distinctiveness of this particular period if we were to get the companies to see that actually it's in the interest to step forward and be more transparent on the specifics about this.
I think there's something interesting there about the fact we're talking about disinformation in the context of a public health emergency around the world, because I watched Mark Zuckerberg's lecture at Georgetown University last year which was live streamed on his Facebook page, I thought the point he made there is right, which is that, even in America, there is a tension between freedom of speech and the harm that speech can cause to other people. And I think that does give us a heightened sense of the importance of these issues at a time when disinformation, can and is killing people.
Yes, I think this is a very key issue, and disinformation here can be fatal in the very short term, if not also have all these medium-term impacts on recovery plans and so on. But I think it's different when you start speaking about regulating speech to regulating telecoms, regulating monopolies, regulating privacy. I think much as there are harms and potential harms, one's got to think about, what existing laws will cover that. For example, if people are selling false cures, that's already prosecuted under fraud. If people are combining disinformation with hate speech, that's often also already covered under existing laws. But the idea that actually one wants to bring in a different kind of legal apparatus for speech that goes through these companies, I think that should be, as I said, a last resort, and that the companies, I hope, like the press, would actually realize that they should step forward and be good public citizens by being more transparent and practicing multi-stakeholder governance of this question.
Yeah, I suppose one of the differences, I think, for me between them and the press is that ultimately the press put their name to everything that they do. And I think self-regulation can work in that context, because you've always, certainly in the UK, you've got the courts. There are other routes open to you, and the editor of the paper is responsible for everything that goes in the paper. The problem we have with companies like Facebook, say, is that if someone in a hard-to-reach part of the world is anonymously spreading disinformation through the platform, and that's caused a real-world harm, and there's a criticism of how effective the company was at doing something about stopping that, or even whether it did at all, there's no recourse. There's no one you can go to. You can't take anyone to court. There's no legal route open to you at all, and nor even the power to audit and inspect the way the company dealt with the problem at the time. And I think that, for me, is one of the big pieces of the jigsaw that's missing. But we may come back to that, or certainly if you want to come back to that, I'll be happy to. But I'd just like to bring in our resident experts, Charles Creel and John Quinlan, just to give us an update on what's caught their eye in the last few days. And Charles, I wonder if you could give us an update of what you've been looking at.
Thanks, Damian. Yes, there's some really interesting stories that are going on out there right now in the world of fake news and coronavirus. A very convincing piece of fake news is circulating about the NHS this week. Michelle Disraeli from Leeds tweeted that the UK government will be telling people by post how they can get their contact tracing app and download it, and then points out how easy it might be for a scammer to abuse the process. And she posts a photo of a letter from the NHS announcing the app and sending the public to a website, nhs-app.site, to download the app. The recipient's address is redacted from this letter, and the letter seems to come from Dr. Robert Bank, Director of Medicine for the Leeds and York Partnership. But it turns out not only is the letter from the NHS a scam, but the scam itself is a hoax. So Disraeli is a cybersecurity professional, and she mocked up the letter to do exactly what she states, demonstrate how easy it might be for a scammer to game a snail mail-based system for the app distribution. Up until a couple of days ago, if you followed the link, you rickrolled to a video of Never Gonna Give You Up. And Disraeli has since clarified her viral post and made it clear that the letter was her invention. There's also a story out there on YouTube, or YouTube-driven, about a theory that's been brewing that claims the COVID-19 figures are highly inflated. This is for both infection and death rates, and simultaneously pushes for a reopening of the economy, and the U.S. economy specifically. The claim is that physicians are being pressured to add COVID-19 to death certificates and diagnostic lists. And because of this, the claim is made that COVID numbers are exaggerated. And what adds weight to this in this particular video is that the video is a press conference that features doctors Dan Erickson and Artin Masihi of Accelerated Urgent Care in California. The doctors also are pushing to galvanize policymakers to reopen the economy, and they claim that COVID-19 is no worse than influenza, its death rates are low, and we should all go back to work and school. These are the standard tropes that we hear. And the story was picked up by local news and Elon Musk, who seems to be playing a regular role in COVID disinformation these days. It was also just as quickly denounced by the American College of Emergency Physicians, who called their claims reckless. YouTube took down the video after a few days, and California Democratic State Senator Richard Pan said the doctors, quote, basically hyped a bunch of data and weren't transparent about their methods. Now, it's worth noting two things here. First, these two doctors own their own facility, and it's a private healthcare facility. And second, private healthcare facilities across the U.S. are suffering financially and indeed laying off staff because patients are putting off elective and low priority procedures and instead sheltering in place as they've been advised. So it's in private health's interest for business to resume as normal. So we have more fake news.
Very good. Well, not very good, very bad, but a very good summary.
Very bad.
John, last time you were able to reassure us that the Illuminati are not behind COVID-19, which was I'd been worried about, but because they do get everywhere, it seems. What's been happening in Infotagion in the last few days?
Yeah, so I've got another target in my sights, we'll discuss in a second, but. Yeah, I think that the one of the main ones we've had this week was actually about an alleged quote given by a Nobel Prize winner that said that COVID-19 had come from a lab, had come from the Wuhan lab, and in fact Professor Honjo has denied making the claim, and there's no evidence that he did. I think the most interesting part about it is, and here's my guilty party for this week, is Alan Sugar's role, who broadcast it on Twitter, and I think that gave it some credence to a lot of people, and that resulted in us seeing a lot of this around social media, a lot of tweets, and we certainly saw it numerous times. So Alan Sugar's on the naughty list, along with Elon Musk, in my opinion, and to make matters worse, he's actually just been reprimanded by the Advertising Standards Agency for doing a naughty advert on teeth whitening. So he's having a bad week. So it's always interesting when we get these things, and they can seem a bit amusing, some of the claims that we get. But I think the way he tweeted it was actually exactly what we're trying to stop, which is, he tweeted it saying, look, I didn't create this, I just sort of found it and wanted people to hear about it. And that's exactly what we're trying to stop, because his claims, or this claim is serious enough. But when you start factoring in the fact that we get a lot of stuff on fake cures, that can be life threatening if people have something, have some misinformation in that regard. So, I think it's important for him in particular, and for everyone, to realize that, the misinformation can be a killer in its own right. And, what starts as something that's a bit lighthearted can get serious very quickly.
And there does seem to be a sort of role that some celebrities have developed for themselves here. I mean, you mentioned, rightly, Alan Sugar, and we previously discussed Eamon Holmes and Amanda Holden. I've seen as well today that apparently Juliette Binoche has shared a post on Instagram about Bill Gates putting GPS tracking chips in COVID-19 vaccines, which
so disappointing.
Yeah, exactly. But I think I think in particular, people with an audience need to be even more careful about the actions that they take. And the final question I wanted to sort of pose was really around another, I suppose, sort of celebrity or really infamous personality, David Icke. Now, he's been deplatformed, if you like, by YouTube and Facebook. He's had his channels removed there. Do you think we will, or we need to see more action like that, where it's not just a question of someone getting it wrong, someone is deliberately using their profile to spread disinformation?
From my point of view, 100% yes. It's not a hard question to answer from my point of view. That it's not the first time, and he's got a right to freedom of speech, but these platforms are very much amplification as well, and it's that bit that is the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah, Nina, Guy, do you have any views on that?
Sure. I think one of the most important ways we can build awareness in society is to actually get some of these large-scale kind of celebrity influencers on board with kind of a societal education campaign. One example from the U.S. kind of media climate I like to give is Deborah Messing. She's been active on the left side of politics recently, but she has a huge audience, millions of followers. And if we were to get somebody like that involved with a messaging campaign to educate people about the right types of informational hygiene that they can be conducting during this pandemic, I think it would have a huge effect. And I also do want to circle back to our conversation about regulation that we were having earlier. I don't want to make it seem like I think that every government should have a cudgel with which they can play whack-a-troll. That is not what I want. And I certainly wouldn't want, for instance, my own president right now to have the authority to decide what content stays up and what gets removed from digital platforms, because we've seen that used to political effect here in the United States. But I do think that the platforms have shown basically criminal negligence in their governance of themselves over the past 4 years, despite all of this attention on them, despite the massive amounts of evidence that have piled up to show that evidence. There has been really very little move toward a more democratic internet, and I think that, there's a way to do regulation, and this perhaps is another a topic for another podcast, but there's a way to do regulation that keeps democratic norms and human rights norms at its heart, that, doesn't divest too much power toward the government or toward the social media platforms, and that makes sure that the conversations that we're having are equitable, that nobody has, that freedom of speech is not traded in for freedom of reach, which is what we have now. And it's a really scary situation, and hopefully it does lead to some change, both on behalf of the platforms, but also, motivate our legislators here in the United States to more action. And I know, Damian, you've been working on this stuff, so I'm sure you'll continue to do so in the future. But I really do think this is a sea change moment, and we need to take that into consideration as we move forward.
Absolutely right. Certainly the approaches to legislation that could be taken is, I'm sure, something we may talk about in a future podcast as well.
Damian, if I can jump in on the celebrity question, there's no doubt, of course, that celebrities, along with some political leaders, are real originators and disseminators of disinformation with a lot of influence. At the same time, they are in the public space, and so it is possible to counter them. But I think the more dangerous area is the kind of thing that Charles was signaling, this fake letter from the NHS about the app that will reach people probably through email, I'm not sure, or even through the post. I did see on a story that on WhatsApp, people are receiving messages that say you've been in contact with somebody who's tested positive and you need to see what to do and click on this link. And of course, it's also a phishing thing. So I think that this private messaging, the private email is something that we need to give more attention to, although it's difficult because it is precisely not really easily in the public space. And I just come back finally to this UNESCO position on press freedom and these two policy papers on the disinfodemic, that really the thing about the news media is that even when it's bad, at least it's in the public sphere. And at least then people can counter it. Rival media can produce critiques, they can debunk it, they can compete for attention. Then truth becomes something that's really up there for contestation, and hopefully the facts will win out. But when you have this huge possibility for private messaging and private email, I think that's the kind of under the table, under the radar stuff that can be very, very consequential. And so what we're doing at UNESCO is to try and persuade governments, even those that don't like independent media, say, look, treat these as your allies in the fight against COVID, because if you don't find some modus vivendi with the independent media, if you don't tolerate them, you are going to create a vacuum by closing them down, and that will only be exploited by this private messaging, and then it'll be out of your control completely.
I think that's a good point on which to end it, because ultimately with private messaging, we do need the public to challenge and question what they see more, because they're the only ones that are receiving that message, or individually people are receiving that message, and it's very difficult to see what's being spread in that way. Well, Guy, Nina, thank you very much for a great podcast discussion, and John, Charles, great to hear from you and have your insights once more. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Guy Berger, Nina Jankowicz, Charles Creel, and John Quinlan. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.